Welcome to University of Wisconsin-Madison Diversity Forum and a presentation on how to accommodate people with disabilities based on their abilities. My name's Julie Johnson. I work in testing and cyber defense. I'm also on the autism spectrum, and that's given me a lot of challenges at various parts of my life. I was not even recognized as autistic until 2011. And misdiagnosed with attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity, and sometimes even mistaken for a mental illness when it wasn't the case. All those are disabilities themselves, but they were not the disability I personally have. And misdiagnosis led to inappropriate accommodations as well as other forms of bias. Once a relative was diagnosed with autism, and it's known to run in families, I was advised to be checked specifically for autism, which is what I have. And once I was able to get appropriate accommodations, I could go on to take classes at Madison College in network security, and then go on to a very good job at UW-Madison, which I'm quite grateful to have. It is a very positive work environment for me. And Laura will introduce herself. Ready?
Hi, I'm Laura Ogle, and I work in business systems security here at UW-Madison. Like Julie, I have a disability as well, though mine is a physical disability known as cerebral palsy. Julie and I share some similar experiences in the fact that we've often experienced unusual and ineffective treatment for our disabilities, but I've had the fortune of knowing my disability for my entire life. That being said, a lot of people assume that cerebral palsy is something you're born with. In my case, it wasn't. It was something that I acquired a few weeks after birth. Julie and I are both welcome to talking more about our individual disabilities and the circumstances around that and the experiences we've had during our Q&A session. You're welcome to ask any questions that you'd like during that time, even if you're worried about them being difficult or offensive questions. We don't mind. Likewise, if you have any questions about the content of our presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. So you're probably wondering what the odds are of having two IT professionals who also have disabilities presenting to you today. The fact is, disability is a lot more common than people realize. We're going to keep two statistics in the US just because it's the most relevant to us, but there's plenty more available online if you're curious about other countries. Here in the US, 26% of people report having some kind of disability. That's a significant portion of the population. We're actually considered one of the larger minority groups, but you wouldn't realize that based on our representation in media. Another unique fact about the disability minority group is that it's a group that someone can join at any time in their life. It can happen to anyone. To give a little snapshot, today's 20-year-olds have a 27% chance of becoming disabled before reaching retirement age. Conversely, they only have a 6% chance of dying before reaching retirement age. So it's pretty scary when you put it that way. You're more likely to become disabled than you are to die. Despite its prevalence, though, you don't really see many of us in the workplace. And that's kind of a holdover of some historical issues that we'll talk about later. But as it stands now, only about 31% of disabilities of people with disabilities between the ages of 18 and 64, also known as working age, are employed. It's pretty sad when you consider there are so many of us. But there are lots of reasons that play into that. Next slide, Julie. One of the reasons that stood the test of time It's the lack of accessible education, skill development, employment opportunities, or healthcare for people with disabilities. Organizations are working to change that, and the ADA has done a lot over the past 30 years, but it is unfortunate to know that this problem persists. Hopefully, the next 30 years will yield better results for us. Outside of institutionalized problems like those, most problems relating to low levels of disability employment have to do with people's misconceptions, negative perceptions surrounding disability in the workplace. One of those fears or misconceptions is the concern of lower levels of productivity from people with disabilities. And that's understandable. Without knowing the nature of someone's disability and how it affects them, it's an easy assumption to make that we won't be able to be as productive. But multiple studies over the years show that productivity of disabled workers is no less than that of their abled peers. In fact, in some cases, it's higher. Another fear employers have is a fear around costs. So potential lawsuits or legal costs or accommodation costs resulting in regular employment functions such as hiring, firing, or setting up someone's office. But again, those same studies show that the benefits of hiring a disabled person and working with a disabled person include things like increased profits, retention, and innovation. And those benefits far outweigh the potential costs associated with employing a person with disabilities. They move into things like, well, what about how our customers are going to react? And again, this is also a fear that's rooted in the way disabled people have been treated in the past. But those studies again show that employing people with disabilities actually improves customer loyalty and satisfaction and may attract more customers to your business than you would have had otherwise. The last fear is the one we're going to focus on the most today, though, and that's coworkers' fears when working with people with disabilities. Coworkers, can go through a lot in attempting to adjust to people with disabilities as part of their team. Some might worry about poor quality of work from their disabled coworkers or having to shoulder more of a workload because their disabled coworker might not be able to, or even missing out on employee incentives like reward programs or bonuses because working with someone with a disability will somehow exclude them from earning that. But the studies we referenced earlier and we'll have available for you in our source slide at the end show that, again, productivity for disabled people is usually not an issue, and therefore it's unlikely to result in any poor quality of work or negative consequences around workloads and rewards. Some trickier situations to navigate are just general interpersonal interactions. A lot of people are concerned that conversations might be more awkward or uncomfortable. They might feel unnecessarily guilty or feel pity towards a person, or they're just afraid of offending someone. This last fear is a big deal because we all know from our various forms of harassment and workplace interactions trainings that serious offenses can have significant consequences. Another issue that I've personally come across is resentment for accommodations, such as, in my case, inclement weather policies. And I gotta be honest, objectively, I can see why people would be upset with this. Inclement weather policies aren't the most forgiving. Typically, your employers require you to be at work unless there is an actual full closure of your offices. Regardless of the weather. except under extreme circumstances like a hurricane or something, right? But in my case, coming to work in the winter was significantly challenging, not just because of the drive, though we all know how much fun that is for those of us that live in snowy areas, but because of a courtyard. There's a small courtyard between my parking structure and my office building. And even though I have disabled parking, which helps a ton, I still have to cross that courtyard. It's really not that far. What is it, like 50 feet? But in snowy and icy conditions, it's not often cleared by the time I get to work. And I've tried everything I could before I had to seek alternate accommodations through policies. I tried varying my work time, my work arrival time, to accommodate for snow clearing schedules. I tried getting more suitable boots or getting those yak tracks things you can put on the bottom to get grip and ice. I even took some hiking poles with me. But no matter what I tried, I was unable to safely cross that courtyard unassisted. And if I needed assistance, I had to hope that there was someone around there who was willing to help me. Otherwise, I'd try and cross, I'd slip and fall. Luckily, I wasn't seriously hurt, but I literally could not get to my office to do my job because of some snow on 50 feet of ground. So when self-accommodation didn't work for me, I went to my supervisor to talk about what alternate arrangements could be made, and I was able to secure the ability to remotely work during that kind of weather, which is great for Wisconsin. Of course, now with COVID, we're all working remote anyway, so this isn't as much of an issue. But speaking of COVID, it's had its own impacts. Some of them are positive. For all of us who are working remotely in a familiar, safe, comfortable, accommodating environment, provided we have the internet connection to support it, of course. It's also easier to self-accommodate at home, set up your office the way you need it to be. And this is true for people of all abilities. For me, though, the positive that probably a lot of people don't consider is that teleconferencing makes my disability less apparent. In fact, it makes it completely invisible, which is a luxury I've never had before. So that's been really fun for me when I'm meeting with new people, especially via teleconferencing. They have no idea I'm disabled, and for once I don't bring it up. And I do notice that I am treated a little bit differently with new people than with people who know of my disability. It's mostly in a good way. Our interactions are much more what one would perceive as normal and respectful. And I really get to showcase my professional skills in terms of people skills and meetings as a result, without that being an elephant in the room. That being said, there are negatives to COVID-19's impact. We're all familiar with a lot of them, like multitasking with childcare or virtual school for our kids can be challenging. It sure is for me. But there are some disability-specific ones as well. People with disabilities are, of course, identified as being at greater risk of serious complications due to COVID. So we're all isolating, we're all wearing masks, but we have to be even more careful if and when we do leave the home. That gets worse, though, when you consider that indications of disabilities can be mistaken for contagious illnesses, including COVID, not necessarily COVID. For me, I most often get stopped and asked if I have polio because of the way that I walk. That might seem ridiculous to you, and that's understandable. Polio doesn't really exist here anymore, but it is still in some corners of the world. So, I've gotten used to those questions over the years, but I've had my entire life to do so. But it's taken on a different tone in COVID. With COVID, people are a lot more cautious, understandably so, but I also get treated as a much more dangerous person to be around than I did before. Like, even when people asked if I had polio before COVID, they weren't doing it because they were afraid, they were curious, but now there's a tone of fear with questions around that. Or I notice people give me way more than 6 feet of distance when I go to the grocery store. Things like that, you know. But again, it's something I'm kind of used to, so I don't let it get to me too much. In terms of work, you know, it's harder for us to access workplace accommodations at home. So, you know, it's taken me a long time to do something like set up my office properly with a desk that works well for my physical needs, and the ergonomic keyboard and everything that I need here at home. I unfortunately missed the window to pick up my equipment from my office, so I had to make do with what I had and make improvements as they became available. You'll notice, though, one of the negatives that we haven't brought up is isolation, and there's a specific reason for that. Next slide, Julie. So I want to take a moment to address something colloquially known as the Ogle laws. The reason is, while isolation might be new for a lot of you as far as COVID quarantine conditions go, it's not new for people with disabilities. This is something that's happened throughout history, because it's easier to deal with disabilities by pretending they don't exist. As cruel as that sounds, that kind of was the mentality of the times. So even in our earlier history, and we're talking several hundred years ago now, if the disability was unable to be cured or the person was unable to be successfully adapted to normal society, people with disabilities were placed in best cases, medical facilities for further research and experimentation, and in worst cases, insane asylums and prisons. In the latter cases, people who were housed in asylums and prisons were treated the same way that the criminals that they resided with were treated. So disability rights were definitely not a priority back in those days. As people realized the humanity of people with disabilities, they began to change how they did things. Medical facilities still existed, but we were no longer relegated to prisons and asylums. If medical facilities aren't available or weren't appropriate, it was more common for people with disabilities to be, for lack of a better term, cloistered at home and cared for by their relatives, which is a positive because, you know, they're in a familiar environment, more comfortable environment, and with people that they knew. But it had its own negatives too. Just because they were home with their families doesn't mean that they were allowed to be out in public. The Ogle laws are a collective reference to local ordinances that were enacted primarily in the late 1800s and persisted for much longer than they should have. The language used in Chicago's ordinance allowed it to ban anyone who was diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object. If someone was considered to be in that category, they were banned from being in public view during peak business hours so that, quote unquote, normal citizens could go about their daily lives and feel good doing it. It really was all about keeping up a certain marketable appearance of a city or an area. Despite advances in laws that were happening around, you know, the 60s, 70s, and forward, the Ogle laws weren't repealed in Chicago until 1974. So there are people who are alive today who personally experienced these laws and lived under them. So when I say isolation isn't new for us, it really isn't. I was born in 1986, so I was fortunate enough to miss this. So for me, it is more of a new thing, but I still experienced it in smaller doses. You know, at first in school, as a kid, I was placed in special education classrooms, often in small groups or on my own, until they could figure out how I fit in the normal classroom and daily schedule. So you know, we're all dealing with the isolation that we're experiencing now, and that has its own consequences. But you know, this is something that we face, unfortunately, on a day-to-day basis, even under better circumstances. So when we have issues like these, institutional issues or misperceptions or even unkind laws, how do we overcome them? Simple answer is focusing on abilities. The easiest way to do that is to start with inclusive conversation. Talking to someone with a disability or talking about disabilities can be uncomfortable, especially if you don't know a lot. But that discomfort is typically a good thing, especially when it leads to respectful questions and supportive answers, or it leads to facilitating for appropriate accommodations, or even if it gives us an opportunity to learn from our mistakes and misconceptions that we've carried. As long as we remain respectful, you don't really have to worry about fearing to offend anyone or you know, be patronizing or condescending. Mistakes are going to happen in conversations that we're unfamiliar with, but as long as we're respectful and our intentions are good, we can use them as the learning opportunity. And there are some tools that you can use in order to facilitate having more respectful, open conversations. Next slide, Julie. One of the biggest things you can do is seek out disability etiquette training. This might be something that you can get from your employee assistance programs or from your HR teams, but there's also some really excellent third-party resources out there. My favorite is the one put together from the United Spinal Association. It provides guidelines for interacting with or talking about various disabilities or people with disabilities. And it's a pretty exhaustive list. It's not the only resource out there, but it's certainly a good starting point. It goes through some general etiquette rules as well that pertain to any potential person with a disability or disability in general. And I'll go through a few of these here just to give you a start. One of the most confusing things is, should I use person first language or identity first language? Person first language is using the phrase people with disabilities or person with autism or person with cerebral palsy. Identity first language is stating the disability first. So disabled people, autistic person. Which one is correct? Well, that depends. There are some groups out there that maintain that person first language is the way to go. As you've noticed throughout this presentation so far, I use either interchangeably, and I don't personally take offense to either choice. Generally speaking, neither one of these is right or wrong. It really depends on a person's preferences, and the best way to find out what those are is to ask. Another thing you can do when talking about a disability or about someone with a disability is to avoid negative descriptors. So, for example, I have cerebral palsy. I'm not suffering from it, and I'm not a victim of it. But you see that a lot in articles and in other media sources when disability is actually being represented. Really, it comes down to, if you're not sure, applying that golden rule: treat others the way you want to be treated. And that just means demonstrating the same level of respect you would use when interacting with anybody, able or not. Next slide, Julie. The last piece of etiquette advice is to remember not to assume disability means inability. We're often more capable than people realize, and especially when it comes to self-accommodating to meet our needs. Julie, you had an observation here that you wanted to make.
Yes, one of the simplest accommodations that both Laura and I used is specialized footwear, but our shoes are very different because they meet a different issue. Laura uses sturdy shoes with good grippy soles and support because of her gait, and this keeps her from slipping. Whereas being autistic, I'm more vulnerable to distractions, so I use a soft, very comfortable shoe with a very thick sole. Very different shoes, but they both accommodate our unique disabilities.
Julie, you're on mute.
When self-accommodation is insufficient, Laura?
Yeah, so while we're able to self-accommodate a lot, and it isn't just in clothing, but I do it in other areas of life as well. Like, I love bike riding, but due to a jiu-jitsu injury, not at all to my disability, believe it or not, I'm no longer able to ride a two-wheeled bike. So I have a tadpole recumbent trike with the two wheels in front, one in the back, and an e-assist. And I go out for really long bike rides as a result. So I get to enjoy a lot of things that quote-unquote able-bodied people do, just not in the way that one expects. But yeah, as Julie referred to, there are times where self-accommodation is insufficient. During these times, we usually go, at least in a workplace scenario, to our supervisor or to HR to discuss the things that we need and the best ways to obtain them. But this isn't just an HR or supervisor only area. Anyone on our team that sees an opportunity can help if done respectfully. Julie had an example here where a coworker helped her out. You want to share it, Julie?
Tremendously. This was actually my first day at UW-Madison, where I had the usual new employee nerves. I didn't know people. And the office chair that was in the office when I first arrived had a squeak that was very distracting. And also because someone with acute sensory sensitivities is best in the simplest possible environment that suits the needs of the job. A very elaborate office chair that most people find comfortable wasn't really appropriate for me, and it isn't. So I asked if there was another chair available, and the person who was kind of orienting me pointed out that there was a spare room where there were a number of chairs being stored, quite a few different ones. And he invited me to go in and see if I could find something that works for me. I tried several chairs and found one that's absolutely perfect for my situation. It's actually a very, very simple chair, and that's precisely why it works. No armrests, no moving parts whatsoever, and completely silent. And this is actually a lot cheaper piece of furniture than the office chairs most people prefer. Accommodation, in many cases, is not expensive at all. And it all depends on the disability and what accommodation is needed, but this is actually very simple. But that accommodation arose from my being willing to ask and the other person being comfortable with having that conversation at an early stage, that a solution was found before work really started in earnest while I was still in orientation. Being able to talk that comfortably both about my disability and the need for accommodation contributed to a very positive, good start in the university position here. As with any team, working productively depends on working together, depending on one another's strengths, compensating for weaknesses. No one person does it all, and that's especially true in IT when there's so many differences in technologies, so many specialized skills. Disabilities can actually become abilities in certain cases. I have an example with what we call the threat map, which consists of a map of the world showing where attacks are originating, and then some surrounding charts with data on the number of attacks and the level of activity in general. I can look at that and spot something out of the ordinary in less than 10 seconds. And that is actually a fairly common factor in autism. My brain has a mental picture of what is normal, and I just snapshot compare that with what I see on the current threat map, and I can immediately zoom in on something that's unusual. That doesn't mean it's a threat necessarily. I still have to go through the process of investigating it, because some turn out to be false alarms. But just the fact that I'm looking in the place most likely to be an issue gives me an advantage over a quote-unquote normal person. It just, there my disability actually turns into a strength. Now we're going to move on to a little bit of a case study here, and this is very much an immediate concern in the time of COVID. There are, the law is passed to require masks in many areas, make an exception for people with disabilities, but that presents some challenges of their own. There are people with some types of disabilities that cannot wear a face covering at all, and yet there is the inescapable reality that going out in public without a mask puts both the person with the disability and others around them at serious risk. And then there's also the problem, and I'm never going to ignore it because I know it's happening. People that do not have disabilities claim they do simply because they do not want to wear a mask. And because that is happening, and people know it's happening, there's been several published incidents about that in the news, that people with actual disabilities that step out in public with no mask are viewed with suspicion, often accused of lying about it or distrusted and feared. But not unlike the misuse of reserved parking for people with mobility challenges, the fact that an accommodation is sometimes abused does not negate the fact that there are people who truly need it. I like to use this case study because it is, in my individual circumstances, very nuanced. It's not a case of I can't do this or I can do this. And this is actually much more common with people with disabilities than is generally thought. There are, for instance, people that use a wheelchair to cover longer distances even though they can walk a few steps. But I'm going to focus on my situation with the mask. I can wear the tight cloth face masks that are generally recommended right now, but because of the acute sensory sensitivity associated with autism, having anything tight on my face causes severe distraction so that my mind cannot focus on the tasks at hand. Obviously, in any dangerous circumstance, such as driving, walking where there is traffic, or performing any type of work where a small error could cause serious problems. I do not want to be wearing anything tight around my face. And yet, there is the dichotomy. Not wearing a mask can present an opportunity for the virus to spread. How I self-accommodate depends on what I'm doing. Obviously, when I'm driving, the safety of the vehicle is the most important. But even walking across a street, if I'm distracted by a mask, could be deadly. I've had a couple of scares already early in the pandemic before I realized how dangerous it was to cross a street when distracted. And I mentioned work already. Shopping is one of the biggest problems. Distracted by the mask, I often leave the store without items I need. And I tried bringing a written list to help overcome the distractions. That didn't work. I was still leaving without items I needed. So what I've learned to do is self-accommodate in different ways, depending on what I'm doing and where I am. Driving, the best thing is that I don't drive with anyone else in the car. I live alone, so I don't have other members of the household. That would be an exception. On the rare times when I need to carpool, the other person drives. That way I can wear the most effective mask possible in a confined airspace. And it doesn't matter if I'm distracted, if I'm a passenger. On the other hand, when walking outdoors, there is room to maintain distance so I can be unmasked. Even in places where the law says that people should be masked or are required to be masked outdoors, if they're not disabled, I can take the exception there without putting others at risk as long as I'm careful to maintain distance. In that case, I usually have a mask in my pocket so that if I do face a situation where I have to walk through a crowd or meet someone in a narrow place, I can put the mask on and therefore avoid any unnecessary risks. Grocery shopping was a real problem for a long time because I could not find any other really good solution. I could take the exception and just go without a mask, but I was facing a lot of hostility from people who didn't believe I was disabled or were afraid for their own safety when near someone who was unmasked. So I eventually created, I'll hold this up here, something that isn't tight, just a cloth draped across my face like a veil. And that, it's better than nothing, I think. I don't know if it's as good as a tight-fitting face mask. It probably isn't, but it's better than nothing. The hat just holds it up because it's loose. I have to pin it to a hat. And when I go grocery shopping, people see that I'm at least trying, that I'm doing the best I can to make everyone safe. And I don't face the prejudice and the fear that I did when I went without. Obviously, the case of if I ever have to work on campus, I can just close the office door. And if I'm alone in the office, campus policy allows me to take the mask off. Now we do have, like I said, we used a lot of government documents for our disability statistics at the end. We do have those available if anyone wants them, if you would like to delve a little deeper into the topic. We can share our references with you. We've set aside some time for question and answers here. Don't be afraid to ask difficult questions. Just be respectful and take this opportunity to practice what we've just been saying. Think in terms of respecting the other person. Apply the golden rule. And if you do make a mistake, this is a learning opportunity. We won't be offended. Trust us, we'll trust you, and we'll all have a lot to learn here. Do you have any closing remarks, Laura?
Just that you brought up a pretty interesting point with your case study about that hostility. And you've mentioned reserved parking or disabled parking a couple of times now. I think I mentioned it once as well. So that hostility is something that's not just experienced under COVID circumstances. I use reserved or disabled parking, and I have faced hostility around it as well, because for whatever reason I'm perceived to be less disabled than someone else despite my altered gait because of my otherwise healthy, youthful appearance. So we often have to skirt around people's perceptions when applying accommodations for our own needs or considering others' safety. It's tricky for us to navigate, and we're doing this on a daily basis. So don't worry if this is difficult for you or uncomfortable or unfamiliar. We're here to help facilitate growth opportunities here through open, honest, and candid conversation.
Starting with the first question, how can we support one another? How can we most effectively bring about change so that we are effectively and inclusively supported and respected in school and workplace environments? The golden rule makes a very, very good starting point. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Try to imagine yourself in the place of the other person. Even if you don't have a disability, you can try to imagine what it would be like if you did, or think of a time when you were in the minority or faced with an awkward situation or request. Everyone's experiences in that area is unique, so it's very difficult to come up with a broad example on the spur of the moment. But I remember a friend telling me about how he'd broken his foot, and there was a stage of the healing process where he had to ask for help in some circumstances. He had a temporary permit to use reserved parking, and like Laura mentioned, there were some people who did not believe he needed it, especially when it was no longer obvious. But there were also cases where he could not carry something that, being a young man, people thought he could carry. And it was because he couldn't put the extra weight on his half-healed foot. So he did have to ask for help then. But also the people he worked with every day knew what the situation was, and they would not ask him to carry or push or do things he wasn't ready to do yet. So just knowing the person is a big help. When you meet someone you haven't met before, though, if you don't know what the disability is, listening and asking questions is going to be your best friend. Laura's mentioned a couple of cases where people tried to help her in ways that were not particularly helpful, just because they did not know her specific needs. I don't know if she'll want to bring up ones she hasn't brought up before or not. That's up to her.
Well, in terms of how we can most effectively bring about change so that we are effectively and inclusively supported and respected, it kind of builds on what Julie has expressed here. You know, listening and getting to know people always helps, but you can do that even if you're a more casual observer. I've done it in academic settings previously. So I'm a student at Madison College currently, as well as an employee of UW-Madison. So I spend quite a significant amount of my time in higher education environments. And at Madison College, there's a particular issue with the way that their campuses are structured. There's not enough parking, generally speaking. There's not enough for anyone. And my classes are all at the Health and IT Education building, so that's a very busy building on that campus. But when it came to disabled students and other disabled people who needed access to that building, there were a total of 7 disabled parking spaces, which were under the jurisdiction of the City of Madison, not the school, because of how disabled parking laws work. But they didn't have time limits on those stalls. So if someone were to use that, they could be parked there all day long, and there's no legal ramifications there. So when they said there were 7 spaces available for students, that wasn't necessarily the case, because those spaces were also shared by visitors, patients of the medical clinic that's in the building, and staff who work at the building. So I would see, when I would come in for class, other people with disabled parking placards or disabled license plates circling a parking lot, hoping that one of those spots would open up. And after the 4th instance of me having to park blocks away and walk into class and miss the entire lecture because it took me so long, I excused myself from class and I made some phone calls. I called Disability Resources, I called facilities, I included the City of Madison as well, and explained, and this is the other thing that it comes down to, is education. Definitely educate yourself at every opportunity. Just like mentioned in some previous talks today, Google is your best friend. Use it. But educate yourself. Encourage the same kind of education and inclusiveness in your workplace. But I educated myself on the particulars of the ADA and some of its language. And I was able to demonstrate in that phone call the results of my research, showing that while the college itself was ADA compliant overall, the particular situation at this building and some of the other buildings on that campus were not. And I proposed that they increase disabled parking. My arguments were so convincing that contractors were hired that day to accomplish that. And in a subsequent conversation with the president of Disability Resources, he told me that I was the first student ever to suggest tackling a parking problem by increasing parking. So something as obvious as that is often overlooked. And if you're in a position where you're observing that there's improvements to be made for a coworker or a fellow student or yourself, speak up and enable other people to do the same. Eventually you will be heard. The next question we received was, does the UW have a practice of specifically educating and supporting supervisors and managers so they can be proactive in creating accommodations for staff who have a visible need for additional support? I'm thinking that every employee shouldn't have to ask repeatedly for attention if there can be good anticipation of likely needs without being assumed to be incompetent. There's a lot there. So first of all, yeah, I agree with that. Ideally, we shouldn't be in a situation where we have to repeatedly ask for things. But you have to remember a couple of things that make this a little harder to pull that off. Disability is a voluntary disclosure. So when we mentioned earlier that 26% of people identify as having a disability, it kind of makes you wonder how many others have disabilities that have not identified as such. And not all disabilities are obvious. When they are obvious, you're right, it's a lot easier to have those conversations. But whether or not UW-Madison has a actual program to help supervisors and managers better enable those conversations and have those conversations, whether disabilities are obvious or not, I couldn't answer. I would definitely refer you to HR to talk about what programs they have now and what programs they could have in the future. But I think if we make it more of a normalized part of our onboarding process, then we would remove that burden of trying to observe what someone's disability is or isn't in the first place. And that's definitely something that we can work towards as an institution. Building on that, the next question here, what's a good way to pose a question to someone with a disability, visible or invisible, if they need accommodations? Is it best to just come straight out and say, are there any accommodations you might need? Julie, you have any thoughts here?
My situation and Laura's are quite different because in an in-person situation, people know she has a disability and generally they do not know that I do. But with a visible disability, it would be probably the simplest way possible. Correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, but the simplest way would be to just ask if they need anything or if they're comfortable, or just to let them know, as the person I worked with in an earlier example, when I pointed out, you know, he was willing to listen to me. You know, when I mentioned that I had the problem with the chair, you know, with the complex multi-moving parts office chair was not appropriate for me. That was a product of a very open, very willing to ask and willing to help conversation. When obviously an invisible disability, the person, like in that case, I had to initiate the conversation, but it started with him bringing in a tone of openness and how are you doing? Do you need anything? Where I felt comfortable bringing it up right away. And that's very important for anyone orienting or mentoring a new employee. Not only because there might be a disability that isn't obvious, but because it's generally good practice. And that's true whether someone has a disability or not, whether they're, no matter who they are. Creating an open, candid, welcoming atmosphere is part of working with a new person.
Right. And as far as the best way to go about asking about those things, it's going to depend on some individual circumstances, whether or not the person's disclosed their disability or talked more granularly about what they need. But if you frame your questions in a way that again, normalizes them, like, for example, what type of desk is best for you to work at? Do you need a particular kind of chair, or do you need a particular type of work environment? Do you need extra time in your meetings in order to be able to facilitate taking notes? Framing it like that is just, it's more about the situation itself rather than about the disability. And really, you could ask anyone those questions, disability or not, and they might answer, yeah, actually extra time would be great. Or, you know what, I could use a different kind of chair. Do we have any like this? So it doesn't necessarily have to be focused on the disability. It's just allowing disability to be included in the conversation.
Moving on to the next one with the storytelling group. There's a couple of issues that come into play there that can be challenging because...
Sorry, Julie, for those who can't see the questions, I'll read it out. I am mentoring a storytelling group for elementary school kids in which we make characters and those characters have adventures. Our group of mentors is racially diverse, which I love. At the same time, we are not diverse in other ways, e.g., we are all women and none of us are disabled. I've been thinking about this and I'm going to play a male character so that there's a male role model too. One of the other mentors in the group is playing a gender fluid character. I don't feel weird about this. I am also thinking about playing a character with a disability, specifically a physical disability, but I feel much more unsure about that. Is that negative, as in, is it cultural appropriation, or is it positive, as in, because we want to represent diverse experiences in our story, or is it both? And how do we do this in a respectful way? This is a really fun question for me, Julie. I don't know about you, but I play D&D. So I'm familiar with the role-playing character environment. It's, to me, and this is going to vary on personal opinion here, but to me, I think this is really cool. Most of those role-playing environments don't handle disability well. In fact, things like D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, for those less nerdy, geeky, whatever the term you want to use, often goes out of its way to eliminate disability. You can heal yourself with potions or spells, or even just rest. If only it were that easy, right? But you could go about this in so many different ways and make it work. The one thing that I would suggest that you do is, as you're developing your character, you do your research to make sure that you're portraying disability in a respectful and accurate way. You don't want to play to typical disability tropes like this came up in a presentation earlier in the forum, but it's a term called inspiration porn. So you don't want to heroize normal actions that other people do. Like I've been told on several occasions, I can't believe you come to work every day with a smile on your face when you have to deal with so much all the time. It's just amazing to me. And while that's well intentioned, you know, that's not what we're there for. We're not a part of your work environment, your school environment, or otherwise, in order to make you feel better about yourself, or inspire you to remember to smile more, or anything like that. You know, there's other tropes as well, like making a Tiny Tim character, or something like that, someone who's pitied, or you know, babied or something because of their disability. You have a real opportunity here to make this person a potential hero in your story, and that's not something we see very often, so I, for one, welcome it. I don't know about you, Julie.
I agree with Laura. I think you've got to think it through, because you want to portray a person with a disability, especially if it's a story that's long enough to have some nuances. The disability exists, but you want the person to be an individual. I'm just checking to see if you said how old these kids are, but elementary school. So obviously the story will not be as long or as involved as an adult novel or movie. But there is still time and space for the person to be more than just a symbol of a disability. If, for instance, the person uses a service dog, the animal would be there, but they would still be interacting with the other members of the group on various subjects, dealing with the situation and having the adventures in their own way, and perhaps with some limitation, perhaps not. But it would not just be the person with the animal. It would be a unique individual who happens to need help from that animal. And that's, I think, where you're going to make this concept a very, very productive thing. And that is to stay away from the simplistic, stay away from the stereotypes, and build up this disabled character as someone individual, unique, someone that children can get to know through the story. Moving on, how can individuals work to combat ableism and promote inclusivity in higher education. My first thought on that one is to get to know the people as individuals. That ties back into the example I was just using with the story, but in real life. I'm a person with autism, but I'm also a unique individual that has strengths and weaknesses, things I'm still learning as a relatively new member of the team, strengths I brought to the job before I ever came to campus. And that is not unique because of the disability and mostly unrelated to the disability. I'm a unique individual who happens to have a disability. And that's the first step. On a larger scale, when we've seen in so many other presentations, activism, the protests in some cases, in other cases, petitions or political activities, I think is the best word. Taking part in this as you have the opportunity, being counted, making your opinion known is certainly very productive. Do you have an opinion on that, Laura?
Yeah, beyond getting to know people as people, in higher education specifically, again, you can look at the way your physical institutions are structured and see if there's improvements that can be made there and approach the appropriate business areas to help with that, like I did at Madison College. Or you can approach it on a curriculum basis. UW-Madison has a committee that I think there's an open invitation for membership right now that you can join to have some influence and input on curriculum improvements. I have done that from a student perspective, so not even as an employee, but I recognized in the required gen eds, the intro sociology class that I had to take, that disability was barely mentioned in the entire text we were given, and there were multiple textbooks. The only time it was mentioned was as part of a larger unit on health, and the intersectionality between health and gender, health and sexuality, health and race was all listed there, and then there was the small paragraph about disability. But there was nothing about us as a cultural group. There was nothing about us in terms of our history and how we have been treated and how life for a disabled person has evolved over time. So I used my final assignment as it was a research paper to present an argumentative case to include that as part of the lower level gen ed curriculums rather than just the higher level sociology courses for those that end up majoring in it. You can do that as a student or you know, you can recognize that as faculty and make changes to your curriculum. There are lots of opportunities. And you can definitely reach out to the appropriate resources like the McBurney Center or HR teams or what have you for other ideas or even perhaps potential collaboration. I think we have about 12 minutes left, so we'll try and get to everyone's questions. The next one we have here is, do you have an affinity group within your units? If so, did you have to start them on your own or did they already exist? I'm relatively new to the university, but I've had the honor of being selected to be a part of our Equity and Diversity Committee for the Division of Information Technology. So yes, our business areas have their own committees. There's also the McBurney Center for Disability Resources on campus that provides services too, so we have that as another resource. So we were lucky enough to have a platform to work with. But I have in the past started initiatives on my own. I've been working in disability advocacy since I was 6 years old, and I built one of the original programs with the help of the teachers, of course, to educate people on cerebral palsy and what it was like and try and demonstrate that, you know, in many respects, I'm just like anyone else. That's not easy to do, and it definitely can't be done alone. So if you're looking to build a program, you know, make sure you reach out to the resources that you have and utilize those third-party resources like United Spinal Association, disability etiquette guides and things like that to start giving you ideas to build a platform. Let's see here. How can you address friends, coworkers who are afraid to use the word disability or talk about disability in general? Again, this is going to vary with personal opinion a bit. Everybody takes things differently, but disability should not be a dirty word. If you demonstrate that it isn't, that it's just another word that we can use as a tool for communication, then that should help over time normalize it for your friend or your coworker. But that being said, disability isn't the only word you can use. Health condition is one of those politically correct terms that I often see used in documentation. Likewise, medical condition or just condition for short. We can always approach it through that way if that makes them more comfortable. Talking about disability can be uncomfortable, and you know it's not surprising or bad that it is uncomfortable. But again, the more we facilitate and normalize these conversations, these respectful conversations, the less uncomfortable it's going to be. Julie, any thoughts on that one?
You've said that one pretty well. And I agree with you that sometimes alternative terms help. I found in my personal circumstance, starting from when I went to Madison College and working at UW, I have made a personal decision to go way out in the open, to talk about being on the autism spectrum out loud, in groups, not to hesitate to talk about it just because it might be overheard. And let people know that in my case, there's nothing to whisper about, but that some people with disabilities might be a little more private. Again, letting the disabled person sort of indicate their comfort zone. If they whisper, obviously it means they want to keep it as private as possible. If they talk about it out loud, obviously that's their decision to come out into the open. For people that do not have a disability, if they're nervous about saying the word disabled, Laura mentioned some very good alternate terms that might be a little more comfortable. Moving on to number 7, we're getting a little low on time here. A special elementary education teacher asking what we feel is the best way to encourage students that they can do what they put their minds to. So many of them already do not feel that they can do anything. And there's a sad emoji there. I think that one, Laura and I have such different experiences in our early years because her true condition was recognized early and mine was not. So people encouraged me instructors are sort of nudging me in a direction that would never have worked and couldn't work because they weren't aware of the condition I actually had. And what I'm trying to say on that one is to help the child. You need to know what challenges they face, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are, and suggest areas where they are going to succeed or where they have a very good chance of succeeding. One of the best things with a kid is to have a confidence builder, something where you know that they have the ability to do something. It might be as simple and age appropriate as building a snowman all by themselves or making cookies. Or sometimes a very short project can really be a good confidence builder. I won't have time to do more than say this in a couple of sentences, but a major turning point in my life was when my computer got a virus. Cash was tight at that point. Technicians said it would cost more than I could put down. So the only way I could get that computer back was to zero the hard drive, erase everything, and reinstall Windows on my own. And at the time, I had no technical background. When it actually worked, when I got that computer back, I found out that I could look malicious software square in the monitor and win. And that really changed my life. That set me on a course to be what I am now. Now, as an instructor, you can't set things up on that scale, but you can give a child something that can help them discover what they can do. And that's going to be very individual, but you can also present ideas in different areas, give them time to explore, time to discover their passions and their abilities. The last one I see here, I'll read that. Due to disabilities, I have a strong interest in accessibility, diversity, inclusion, and equity. What advice can you give so that I can translate this interest into a career? Laura, can you have some insight on that since you have more experience with active advocacy?
Sure. I'll preface this with the fact that I haven't made it my primary career. I've just made an effort to make it part of my career, and that's my career as a student and as a community member, as well as in the workplace. The advice that I can give is, again, to continue your education, even for someone who's been a disabled person for their entire life, like I have. There's still more to learn. So make sure you're continuing to educate yourself, especially where it intersects with things like race, gender, sexuality, and so on. Those are some very difficult areas to pin down. Beyond self-education, again, I would make an effort to act on an opportunity when you see it, even if it's just framing an assignment the way that you do, and building a portfolio from that. Additionally, social media is a great way to build your voice. There are a lot of activists who specialize in that on Facebook and especially Twitter. If you search around Twitter, you'll find some amazing communicators that have made full-time careers out of disability advocacy. But you can do more online as well. You can start a blog or get involved in community groups online, or hopefully in person again whenever COVID becomes less of a problem. There's so many ways. You can even reach out to professors or other coworkers or friends that you know of that are involved in these spaces and see if you can join them, or if you can collaborate on a project or an endeavor of some kind. Most employers have organizations within the workplace you can get involved in. I get involved in equity and diversity committees. It's almost like a habit these days. So that's another way to build up skills and exposure in the area. There's lots of ways. And of course, if you're not sure what's in your area, again, Google is your friend. Back to the special education question real quickly. That question hit close to home for me because with the COVID circumstances and changes to how curriculum is delivered, it's actually negatively impacting my son right now, who is also on the autism spectrum. He's in first grade. We are still trying to figure that out. Every kid is different, regardless of disability or lack thereof. And then you throw in disability on top of that, and every disability presents differently. I can't even begin to imagine the challenge that you have as an educator. But if you can get the kids involved, make them an active part to whatever level they're capable of in accommodating, you will definitely make more progress. I think we've got less than a minute left here, so just want to thank everyone for their time today and all of these great questions. I hope we've provided some insight for you and at least a foundation for you to go out and learn more and become more involved in our community.